I think it was Ken who figured this out, that we have this process that before we really start anything, we always say, well, how's it supposed to end up? And so that happens at the scene level and also at the novel level. And in our case, the trilogy level.
Well, I think when we start ideating for a story, a book, I think very early on in the process, we want to think very deliberately about where do we want the narrative to end? Where do we want the main character's arc to end? And where do we want the plot to end? And how much of an end is it going to be, right? Is it going to be something that's really definitive, that's, there's like nothing left? Or is it going to be an end where we still have, some threads that we can pull on to maybe write something else after it? But I think once we have that, it helps drive us forward.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 116 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me, as always, my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, my dear MJ Kuhn. How's it going, MJ?
Hi, I'm lovely. How are you?
Doing very well. Hi. And if you want to support MJ, that lovely human being, go get her debut novel, Among Thieves, for just a wonderful plethora of heists and thieving and hatchets. There are so many hatchets. There's hatchets on the cover. MJ has hatchets tattooed on her arm. It's awesome. She has physical hatchets. Life is good. And if you want to support the sequel, Thick Ass Thieves, the Green Baby, you can support her by getting both of these amazing books.
Yes, and you can support Adrian by checking out his debut novel, Mushroom Blues, for all your fungal noir psychedelic mushroom needs.
Yeah. You don't need to take psychedelics. You can just read my book.
You can just experience them. Yes, through the magic of fiction. It's beautiful.
Through the magic of fiction.
It feels like reading rainbow vibes.
Oh my God. Hell yeah. That's a deep cut, MJ. I love it. As well, a quick note for everyone out there listening or watching the SFF Addicts Patreon and merch store are live, so check the links in the description to support what we do here. Also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And now joining us once again is the amazing dynamic duo of Julia Vee and Ken Bebelle, co-authors of Ebony Gate, the Seattle Slayer series, the newly released Blood J, Go Pick It Up, and much more. Welcome back, you two. How's it going?
It is great to be back.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
It's been so long since we last spoke.
It's been ages. It's been a queen's age. All that talk about kitties, and we had to take a break. A heads up. This is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Julia and Ken, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know them better. Today, though, we're hitting rewind as we skip to the end and talk about writing from the end. Before we dig deeper into the episode, a quick word from our sponsor.
Bren Caius is a living legend, the greatest warrior of her age. But much of her legacy is a lie, fabricated by those in desperate need of a champion. As High General of Aemon, Bren has grown weary of commanding a dwindling army against the Gnoll warlord Kret Bonebreaker and his fearsome legion. Amidst the bloodshed, she must lead her soldiers to victory while contending with a disloyal advisor, a mysterious prophet, the cruel ambitions of nobles, and ghosts from her past. The fate of Aemon rests upon a single epic battle, one of fire, steel, and magic. Can Bren stand against the darkness and become the hero she's expected to be? War of the Hounds is a gripping tale set in the world of the Dryad's crown, and based on Shakespeare's Henry V. It's the story of Bren's greatest triumph and her most heartbreaking failure. War of the Hounds is available for free. Visit thatdavidhopkins.com and sign up for the Epic Fantasy newsletter to receive a free download of this ebook.
And now, enjoy the rest of this episode of SFF Addicts. So to start off, can the two of you lay out sort of your mindset when you start writing from the end of a story?
I think it was Ken who figured this out, that we have this process that before we really start anything, we always say, well, how's it supposed to end up? And so that happens at the scene level and also at the novel level, and in our case, the trilogy level.
Yeah, I think when we start ideating for a story, a book, I think very early on in the process, we want to think very deliberately about the where do we want the narrative to end? Where do we want the main character's arc to end? And where do we want the plot to end? And how much of an end is it going to be, right? Is it going to be something that's really definitive, that's, there's like nothing left? Or is it going to be an end where we still have, some threads that we can pull on to maybe write something else after it? But I think once we have that, it helps drive us forward. And I know for me, this really crystallized in my head when I think like 2 or 3 years ago, I did like a bunch of flash fiction contests. There's a big one with a group called NYC Midnight, and they run about like 7 or 8 short flash fiction contests every year. They cost money to enter, which is kind of but they're really good at forcing you to iterate and write a bunch of stories really, really fast. And you only have 100 or 200 words to write it. And when I was doing this process, I figured out that if I knew how the story would end, I knew then I could figure out where to begin it so I could finish it within 100 words. And then I realized that that's what we were doing in our big stories too.
That's really, yeah. Because when it comes to flash fiction, it's like you have to be so precise.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Right.
No,
but it's amazing that you were
flash
able to
fiction.
translate that precision to sort of like a broader scope of storytelling. Is brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, you have freedom in the long form, right? Each word can it doesn't have to have the same kind of heavy lifting that it does in Flash. But for me, I always come back to character. I have to know, like, what is the transformation this character is going to undergo, and like, where are they going to end up? So the finishing point for this character is what keeps me anchored during the writing process. And I use archetypes for this. So for Ebony Gate, Emiko, very traditional fantasy. Um, is the warrior archetype when she starts, right? But that's not where we conclude with her at the end of the trilogy. And so we knew that going in. We like knew that in book 1.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we all know that endings are super vital, right? It's like critical, and a lot of things. I think is why writing book 3 of a trilogy or book 2 of a duology or book 1, I guess if it's a standalone, is extra scary, because your readers are really hoping for that payoff. Can you guys talk a little bit about the importance of nailing the ending, and then maybe if you guys have examples of a story or two with an ending that you love, and why it works, right?
That can even be film and TV.
Yeah, film, TV, anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Video games.
I think I'll let Ken start this one, since this was like a big part of his entire career, reason for his job, everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about Empire, the best Star Wars movie in existence.
Agreed.
And honestly, that's definitely something that I didn't appreciate nearly as much when I watched it when I was little. Star Wars, A New Hope was a much more impactful ending for me, because it was like everything is good, right? It's like, Luke, destroys the Death Star, they get rid of Vader, like all that stuff. It ticks all the boxes for like the good guys win, and they get that medal ceremony at the end. And it's a very feel good ending. It wasn't until I was much older that I realized how much of a better ending Empire is, because of what I call the half a loaf theory, right? That you don't give your main characters everything at the end of the book or at the end of the scene, right? So it's it's a yes but ending, right? So you get this, but you don't get this, right? So they got away, but they lost Han, right? That ending for me, it really resonated with me, I think, because it was much more of a mood, I think, where it made me think about, like, okay, this is how much they've done to get here, and then how much more do they have to do. So I think it's a good ending because it hints at a larger world that the story inhabits. So it's not just that the story is not confined to the movie, right? You know that there is other stuff happening that is beyond the bounds of the movie that you didn't see.
I also like endings that can be surprising, right? So, like in Lord of the Rings, this whole quest for Frodo to destroy the ring, and how it happens. I mean, spoiler, he doesn't do it, right? So,
Oh no!
sorry,
Well, think
listener.
about how many people failed to destroy the ring. It's like Isildur. Come on.
Right. And so it almost felt like surprising but inevitable, right? That the you knew to be satisfying the ring had to be destroyed, but the manner in which Tolkien decided that this ring was going to be destroyed was actually pretty surprising, and enjoyable, right? Because of that, I found that to be like one of the really interesting endings of great films. I agree with Ken. Like A New Hope, it's satisfying because it ticks all the boxes. It is like the classic hero's journey. But I actually liked Rogue One better.
Oh yeah, that is such.
And I
Rogue One
found
is
it more
great.
moving. You knew it had to end that way, but it was still satisfying.
Yeah.
You know?
Which is also why Andor is like doubly satisfying, because you know how it ends. So
Yes.
good.
Yes.
Oh
Very good.
yeah, I'm there with both.
Andor
of
is
you.
the best. Andor is the best Star Wars that doesn't have any lightsabers.
Yes, and that is the Star Wars that I'm enjoying more and more.
Yeah.
Yeah,
like,
lately. Same.
MJ and I bitched a little bit on our bonus episode about how much the
We did.
Skywalker
We had
suck.
a little kvetch fest, if you will.
Yeah.
Were you surprised when you watch Andor how cyberpunk it is?
It's so good though. I love the
Right? Yeah.
It feels like, especially in terms of the aesthetics, the atmosphere,
Right.
the set design and everything as
Yeah.
well, felt like so Blade Runner. It felt so
Oh yeah.
sort of like early Gibson, you know what I mean? Like
Very.
oh,
Yes.
yeah, it was just so good. More Andor, please. I know there's a season 2, but like, come on, Disney.
Like, let's go.
So for the two of you, I want to talk about balance, because I mean, we've been talking about Star Wars. There's always balance. Planning the ending ahead of time, but also allowing for organic story development. How do you two balance that?
It's totally accidental. I will say that this is not at all intentional. So what happens is, like, the editor might say, "Hey, Julia, can you send us a little synopsis of the next book? I have a marketing meeting." So we'll write up a little something and we'll say, "Okay, this is what we think is happening in this book." We'll write the synopsis, we'll send it to our editor, and then a year later we send her a manuscript where we didn't actually write that book. So I think that's happened twice now. And I would say that the ending stays the same, but like the road and the exploration, I mean, we're still exploratory writers when we get down to it. But we do try to structure our writing. We do have scenes, and we know how we want to turn a scene at the end of each scene. So we want there to be a positive to negative, or a negative to positive, or a revelation at the end of each scene.
Yeah, I just finished a scene in the current manuscript where I knew the characters were. I mean, as just as an example of like the way we write, like I had a scene set up in my head where it was going to be two people sitting in a room discussing this conflict between their families, and then I was talking to Julia about it, and then she suggested, well, actually, why don't we change the setting to this? And it worked out really well because in changing the setting, it became a callback to an earlier scene in one of the prior books. And as I was writing it, like the exploratory part of me made up some completely unexpected stuff as it was going through. But because I knew where I wanted it to go, I still ended up at a good place where I hadn't veered so far off the track that we weren't heading in the right direction still.
Yeah, it's like giving yourself enough of a roadmap. It's like I think of it like a road trip, you know? It's like you've got your major destinations, you've got your little detours and stuff like that. And I think the fun is kind of in those exploratory moments, but for the two of you, also for the fact that you're collaborating together, you get to have collaborative exploratory moments that might, for the most part, like I would imagine, end up in a revelation for one or the other, that like, oh shit, this is so much better than it ever could have been.
Well, I like how you're, optimistically describing it like a road trip, and I'm thinking it's like bumper bowling, where you're like, you know,
I just like road trips more than bumper bowling, that's just me.
well, it's aspirational.
We
Someday
can
we'll
throw
be like
bumpers
the
on the
road
side of the
Someday
tripper.
it'll
road,
feel
whatever
like
you
a
want.
road trip.
One day, Julia. Oh my god. Well, in a similar vein, though, how do you handle something like subplots? Because Ken, you were mentioning last episode, it's like we were talking about Andrea Stewart's sort of the ways in which you plan a series or a trilogy in particular through these sort of like plot one of book one, plot two of book two, etc., but also these overarching plots. But how do you handle something like subplots when you're writing towards the main story's ending and sort of like trying to tie them up effectively? Or referring back to what you said last episode, Ken, it's like deciding which ones are the most important to tie up as effectively as possible, which ones can you allude to, that kind of thing.
I mean, I will say that in the first two books, it was a lot easier because I wasn't looking at the end of the third book, right? And so the subplots that we didn't close at the end of book one or book two, I wasn't really worried about them because some part of me was like, oh, there's another book. And, we can just take care of it in the next book.
It's future Ken's problem.
Yes, it's future Ken's problem.
And subplot procrastination. It's great.
Yeah. And now I'm future Ken cursing past Ken who left this, this basket of problems on my doorstep. I think when it comes to prioritizing, we have to prioritize for Emiko, right? She needs to have the ending that works for her, works for the story, and is going to be satisfying for the reader. Then I think, as far as prioritizing, then like the ones that get triaged after that are then going to go in order of like how they radiate away from Emiko, right? And the subplots that are closest to her are probably going to be resolved. And then the further away they get from her, then, we might be able to just hint at something that happens off screen, but isn't necessarily as important because it's not as close to her.
Yeah, that's interesting about when Ken says close as like distance. I've noticed in books that I've enjoyed, sometimes the subplot is like the romance of the side character, or seeing couple side characters get together. That can be like very heartwarming, especially if the overall tone might be more unpredictable or a little grimmer. So um, that aspect of, a lot of people love found family in their literature, and I'm no different. And I think that's not the primary plot, but it's the byproduct of what happens, right? So um, if the things that you're writing are driving the narrative forward, right, to carry the protagonist through to their transformation, then yes, every decision you make about the subplot does it assist in shaping this transformation, right? And then anything extra, if you can get it in there, it's really maybe like a little bit of fan service, right, for your readers who have stuck with you through book after book and like would love to see this resolution of this little plot line here or there. And I know in film and TV, they like call it like the B line or whatever, right? So they have ways to address it too.
Yeah, but I feel like TV in particular is a bit more like, I don't know, if you look like at a show like Friends, they kind of use subplots as a jumping off point for like main plot progression as well. Where it's like, we'll do an entire episode focused on like Chandler and Monica or something like that. And then that will somehow like
Phoebe's cat.
Phoebe, yeah, but like somehow these like minor, seemingly like minor things, or like something that involves fewer characters or side characters or what have you, tend to even on their own manage to drive the main plot forward, which I really enjoy when subplots have, they don't need to have like a ton of significance, but I think if they're able to contribute something towards the end and making that journey and the ending like a little bit better, I think it makes it worth it.
Yeah, and we talk about, we're saying, talking about like where the ending is, like as we go and we open these subplots, usually very early on in the process of that, that now sub process of that subplot in the big plot, we'll usually talk about like, where do we want this to end up? So like, as far as, like Emiko and so in Ebony Gate, if Emiko and Adam and her ex-boyfriend Gamon, like we pretty much had all that figured out before we started writing it. Like we knew where we wanted those relationships to end up. And we opened up ideas about like Leanna and Freddie and Fiona and Uncle Jimmy and not even if we can't necessarily give them all the screen time, we know where those characters are supposed to be at the end of the last book.
And you got the love
It's funny because we knew the ending. And I actually got this bit of advice from Jim Butcher, who taught a craft class at Superstars writing seminars in Colorado Springs. He said that if you have a problem in a scene, it's usually not that scene that is the problem. It's the setup to the scene. So he said in his own experience, typically to fix the scene, he had to go back and rewind to build it up. And we had the same problem when we started Ebony Gate. We had someone do a dev edit and they said, this fight scene is like a little anticlimactic, right? And it's the big set piece of your book. Like maybe you should tune this. And so we kept making it longer, but it wasn't fixing it. And so what we realized needed to happen was we had to build up the villain more. So we ended up at that stage, the manuscript was 60,000 words. And when we were done building up the villain so that the fight scene felt more climactic, it ended up being 110,000 words.
Wow. Added 50K for that.
Wow.
Yeah. So
and that was really a problem of not knowing the villain's endpoint.
Yeah. So even though we knew the protagonist's endpoint, we actually had not concentrated enough or given enough screen time to the villain. So that would be our other craft bit of advice, right?
Yes, don't be afraid to kind of rewind and look back. Well, I also want to talk.
Just a quick aside. The thing you brought up about Jim, if people want to go check out episode 80, he has a whole masterclass on scenes and sequels.
Yeah,
that's
true.
Exactly what Julia is talking about.
Right?
Yeah.
A whole thing. Good plug.
A
whole thing. Yeah. Well, I want to talk about kind of, it's something I know I struggle with, which is foreshadowing the right amount, trusting your readers to pick up on things without spoiling your own ending.
Oh,
right?
boy.
We all know Ken's good at foreshadowing.
How do you approach, right, this kind of foreshadowing the ending without giving too much away? How do you strike that balance?
I find that Ken and I tend to do, we tend to underwrite on the foreshadowing because stuff is in our head and we're like, well, it's obvious because it's been living in our head for so many years. And so for us, the revision or the copy edit part could be making it more express And it's not that we don't trust the readers, it's that we don't trust ourselves, right? That we have actually been too secretive about some of the things that should be foreshadowed. So we find
and
that
over trusting the reader.
yeah. I find that like actually during revision is when we put back in some of that stuff that we thought was obvious, but it actually never made it onto the page from our brain.
Yeah, like Julia said, when you're writing a scene and like let's say it's the best case scenario, you know exactly what needs to happen in the scene. You just need to somehow regurgitate the words from your brain onto the screen, right? Um, and in your head what everybody's motivations are. And so when you write that somebody looked across the room and glared and and made a face, you know exactly what's going on in that person's psyche. But if you don't put it on the page somehow, then that's when you start to lose the readers. And that's the problem that we have is that I think, like Julia said, we're just afraid of like putting down too much. But I don't think that's ever been an issue from our editor. I don't think they've ever said you wrote too much here. You need to take some of it out. You're giving too much away.
Well, that's the beauty of underwriting, right? Like I know MJ,
Yeah.
you're like that as well. Where you tend to add a lot more
In edits,
world
yeah.
foreshadowing, characterization, and edits. Yeah, it's tricky business. I tend to be an overwriter, so I'm just like, screw you all.
You're cutting later, yeah.
I am just like trimming hard. It's yeah. But it's
cutting's faster than adding.
Right?
Yeah, but then again, like adding, it's an opportunity to add things that are like really meaningful for like the purposes of the story, especially with something like foreshadowing, or especially like this character, I missed something about the way that this character is developing in this particular scene. If I've written too much, and it's harder in a particular case like that to be like, okay, I need to trim down this, like, and then I start to get inside my own head of like, oh, like what's most important, like what are the details that I have to keep. When you're adding stuff, there's a lot more flexibility there to be like, okay, you can experiment with, okay, how can I augment this scene, how can I add to it in a way that is going to be like really meaningful for this character, for this scene, for the progression of the whole story, for the ending, for everything really. And I think pacing is another thing that when you're in edits, you have a lot more control over something like pacing. You can really fine tune it in a way that pushes the reader on a trajectory where they're getting all the right information at all the right time. They feel engaged. They get that action when they want it. They get those slow scenes when they want it. They get that little bit of romance when they want it. All those different things. For each of you, like, how does pacing play a role in setting up the ending, while also sort of giving readers the experience they need for the ending to be as effective as possible, if you know what I mean?
I like a longer ending, and that's just my preference as a reader. So it's possible that that's probably my preference as a writer as well, is because I do want to spend that last bit a little bit longer with them after all the drama and the hardship that the protagonist has endured. But so I do like the medal ceremony, right at the end of a New Hope. But
You want that
I
sweet denouement.
Yes. So for me, the prolonged ending is more engaging as a reader. That's just something I like. But that's a preference thing.
And that kind of affects how you approach something like the third act, or if you're writing a 3-act structure or anything like that. But
Yeah, I mean, we always will have a big fight scene because we love a big fight scene. So, but that's like not negotiable for us.
I think what happens too is when we because we're thinking about the end for so long, it gives us a lot of ramp to dream up like what is the end state going to be like, and it gives us a lot of time to think about like Julia was saying before, like fan service or like Easter eggs that we can throw in at the end. Just like this, because of this, like this cool little twist, it has like almost nothing to do with the story, but I really want to be able to fit it in, but it only really fits at the end after everything is done. And I love that stuff. It's almost like a little behind the scenes at the end. It's almost like the blooper reel, at the end of the movie, right?
That's why the Hong Kong action movies are so great. They always have the blooper reels at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about middles though? Like how do you like knowing your ending and being able to sort of like pace towards that? How does that help with the middles? Because
the climax is your ending. So you build to the climax,
and then you get that denouement.
Then you get to the that'll get you through the middle. Just make sure you're always building to that climax. Just keep breaking the story down into other segments, smaller segments, and then always know where your endpoint is for each of those smaller segments.
Yeah, I was listening to your podcast, and Martha Wells, I think, said something super interesting. She said, the middle's when all the interesting stuff happens. As a reader, that's the part you like reading, And I thought, oh, that is such a nicer framing, like than the messy middle or
like,
what, all
the slump,
the hardship that we,
the
right,
soggy middle.
Yes, the saggy middle.
Everybody loves that.
Oh, I said soggy.
Oh, okay.
It's all soggy.
I was thinking of like a really just like shitty soggy sandwich. Like only the middle is soggy.
That is what I think of every time I'm writing the middle of a novel.
You think about the middle of a movie, everybody loves like that, like the training montage.
Yeah.
And that, it's really hard to do that in a book, but that is the middle, right? And everybody loves that part.
So like the middle,
it's almost like required, ideal, right?
Yeah.
So the middle could be like the ideal part for something as heavy as like characterization. You know what I mean? Whereas like so much of the setup of the world of everything that's going on is front loaded to the beginning, and like the middle is where you can get into like the meat of this character, where it's like in Ebony Gate, for example, like with Emiko, so much of her characterization is coming through in the middle of the story where she's interacting with these different people. She sees
unraveling the mystery, those conflicts.
She meets this new guy. He's kind of like a dick. It's like, I'm just gonna take you down in this Brazilian jiu-jitsu class because fuck you. But those are the moments where it's like you're able to kind of perhaps like ramp up the stakes a little bit more slowly, but also kind of engage the reader with more character depth kind of thing.
Yeah, it's an opportunity for more immersion, right? And because the try-fail cycles can be in that segment, how your character responds to failure is like a really good way of showing who they are, right?
Just keep tossing water balloons at them. See what happens.
Right? Just keep throwing things at them.
I feel like water balloons is way too nice. I feel like light them on fire or something, like fill them with acid.
I thought that's what it was. It's like get them up a tree, light the tree on fire, right? It's
right.
Like standard writing advice.
That's what I've heard, but equally unfriendly.
Yeah. Any number of things, but I feel like water balloons is like, I can take that.
You can light the tree on fire and then throw water balloons. So those are just like moments of respite for them.
Okay.
Tiny bits of hope.
False hope.
False hope, yeah. Well, let's dive a little deeper into character, because I feel like we've kind of touched on a lot of points related to the character arc, building towards the final challenge, that final confrontation, making sure that it feels climactic. Gosh, you guys added 50,000 words to make sure that was the case. How does writing from the end make it more possible? I was going to say easier, but that feels like the wrong word. To kind of weave those character and plot threads together in a way that just feels organic and, satisfying for the reader.
For me, it's about their choices, right? If you know they have to end up in this other state, the choices they have to make might be not the first choice, right? So, like, Donald Moss talked about this in one writing workshop. He's like, it's typical for someone to write that the first response is anger. He's like, but what else could they feel? Maybe they could feel other feelings that would give this character more depth, right? Like, and so it's the same with driving. If you know that at the end of this book, they have to end up in this other emotional, physical, altered state, then they have to change, right? So it's the change parts that I think are how you weave the character and the plot line together.
And those changes can be bad or good.
Right, right. And you had that for Henrietta,
Mm-hmm.
right? She had to change a lot.
Yeah. And I've had a lot of readers who are like, I hated her in the beginning. I was like, yes, that was the point. And
you're like, good, you're supposed to.
I love hard-boiled cop type of dramas. And one thing I had to ask myself when I was reading Mushroom Blues is like, what if Henrietta were a man? Would I hate him this much?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
And that was really like holding up a mirror to be like, oh, what is this negative response, this instinctive negative response to Henrietta? It's like, if she were a man, it's just
we all have it. It's great.
And it actually
You
made
just
the
created
reading.
a catch tune for that. Great job,
Thank
MJ.
you. It's the worst catch
Nicely
tune
That's
of
your
all
jingle.
time. I get that as a soundbite.
Oh my god! But Julia, Henrietta actually started out as a man in
Oh.
my outline, and then when I started writing the book, I was like, this isn't working, and so I tweaked that character a lot, like changed it to a woman, kind of like played around with her age a little bit, changed the perspective. So originally it was third person, I changed it to first person, so there was like more internalized reaction, sort of like monologue and stuff like that, and it just worked out so much better because I was like, yeah, too much hard-boiled fiction, too much noir, too much of like stuff within the detective police procedural genres. It's like, yep, it's a dude and
Yeah, a
he's
dude who was a
yeah,
former alcoholic,
yep,
right?
exactly. It's like here's a gruff dude in his 40s or 50s, and he became a PI because he fucked up his job on the police force or something like that. But like, I just felt like there's so much opportunity to really play around with um characterization when you do know the end, because I knew Henrietta's end as well. I knew it's like, this is how I want her to change so that she is able to basically be in a certain emotional and mental and psychological position for the rest of the series, kind of thing. um and like a big part of that is kind of like what you were talking about earlier, Ken, like the climax and sort of building towards the climax. And I think having your protagonist kind of meet some sort of epic confrontation, whether it's with themselves, whether it's with like an external force or a combination of things, I think really adds to a story. And so for the two of you, when it comes to the stories that you've written, how do you ensure that that final challenge, that confrontation feels appropriately climactic? And are there ways that knowing the ending can help reduce the possibility that that climax is anticlimactic?
Yeah, I mean, it does have to be like surprising but inevitable, right? That they they end up in a certain place. I think that learning the scene and sequel method that Jim Butcher talks about in like, I think you said episode 80, um, that helped a lot because it gives you as a reader and a writer the opportunity to have that pause, right? Like, something big has happened and now this is the emotional fallout where they're processing. And so if you can build those in as you are ramping towards the climax, you're giving your character that ability to reflect that maybe they were wrong about something, right? And that's part of how the transformation occurs.
Yeah, that reflection is so key. Ken?
And I think a big part of making the end feel right is earning it along the way. right? And so if you know where you want to end up, then it helps you figure out where on the road you need to put the challenges for your character that are going to force that change, right? And you know that the first challenge is not going to change your character, right? But it's going to challenge their worldview or whatever it is that they need, and that each subsequent challenge is going to, chip away at the thing that you're changing, so that when you finally get to that transformation, you've bought it for the reader, right? You've earned that thing that you're going to do with that big set piece, with that big fight or that big argument or whatever, and you've laid all the groundwork. And knowing the end helps you build that ramp to it.
Yeah. It's like the meaningful aspects of the ending come from all of those accrued moments. I think, like it's kind of like an accretion effect across an entire story.
Like Julia was saying earlier, like if sometimes the problem in your scene isn't in your scene, it's in the scene before. And a lot of that's what happens a lot of times. It's like, we didn't earn this yet. So we need to go back and lay some groundwork. Luckily, when it gets out there, it's like we did it that way from the beginning.
The beauty thing about having multiple drafts. I always say that. I'm like, there's always another draft. You fix it later. Well, let's talk about how that plays in with series too, because I'm curious how you approach writing the endings. I'm honestly, I want to talk specifically about Blood Jade, because I feel like for trilogies, often the middle book is especially tricky, because the book 1, you get to start the entire story arc. Book 3, you have to close off the entire story arc, which is a whole new challenge. But book 2 kind of falls in this nebulous place, doesn't it, where it has its own story arc. But how does fitting that into the larger narrative of the series, how did that go for you guys, and how did you plan out where book 2 would end, I guess?
And not just story, not just like plot, but also I think like sort of thematic arcs.
Yeah,
as well.
Themes, character, all of it.
Our motto on book 2 was just to dial up everything to 11. Like, if we loved it personally, we were just going to go really big on this scene. We were like, oh, army of yokai? Sure. Like, we were just going to absolutely put in the things that we loved and not worry about whether or not it made sense. And the feedback from the early readers and the advanced readers has been so positive. So I feel like it worked doing it that way. And so I would say that with Blood Jade, we were not careful, right? We just said, we want to have all this stuff that we love. We want to have a big reveal about her family. Let's get it all in there. And that was sort of the mindset of going in for writing it.
And like Julia said, we wrote a synopsis that only vaguely resembles the finished product. But I mean, looking back at that original synopsis, I'm glad we wrote the story that we did, because like Julia said, we had an idea for where we wanted to go with this story. I think the place we were mentally when we wrote this book, I mean, the first book had been sold, and we were waiting through this interminable process for actually like finalizing all of that. And while we were waiting for that, we wrote this book. And I think we didn't really have, we kind of psyched ourselves out of that sophomore slump, because we didn't have any expectations for like, oh my gosh, we have to write this book and it has to be so much better than the first book and all this other stuff. And so we kind of stumbled into writing what I think is a really, really good sequel with a really propulsive story. And, I think in the process of knowing that we wanted like the themes about her and her family and her finding out about her history and things like that, I think we ended up just naturally tying it all into the kinds of things that we had in book 1. I mean, I wish I could tell you that like we had this whole grand plan about like where book 1, 2, and 3 were going to end, but we didn't really. I mean, we kind of just made it up as we went along.
But
and we made the pieces fit.
Yeah, we tuned for the emotional ending of book 2.
Yeah, for
Ken
sure.
and I were really careful about, at the end, the feelings that she has, the feelings the reader would experience with her. We knew what we were aiming for there. And so in the revision, it was about making sure that that was credible. Um, because there is a lot of action and magic, and it's a fantasy adventure story, right, set in Tokyo, and also a bit of a portal element to it. So it was so much fun to write, but we knew that the ending, we were fine tuning that for the notion that sometimes you can't go home, and that was what was our theme for Bloodjade.
Yeah. Well, let's build on this, Julia. You set us up perfectly with the segue. You got this. Emotional payoff. Like, I think emotional payoff is one of the biggest sort of factors in what makes an ending truly great. Like Ken with Empire Strikes Back, the emotional payoff is just off the charts. Because it's also like there's so many like loose threads that you're just like your heart is broken in so many ways,
Yeah,
or in Lord of the Rings where you're just like Frodo didn't fucking throw it into the fire.
Damn it, Frodo!
So I feel like that emotional payoff really amplifies everything that you set up before. It really amplifies the characterization that you've set up. It amplifies the themes that you've been playing with. So let's elaborate on this in terms of how to achieve that emotional payoff and really make it as satisfying as possible for the reader.
I think Truby was talking about his newest book, and he was saying how love is actually one of the hardest emotions. And so it's especially impressive then that in a romance where you already know what the ending is, right, that the love interests will end up together, that you can still be surprised and delighted as a reader for how they get there, right? And that they might change, and that maybe the sum of their parts is greater, right? So like all of that is or I'm sorry, did I get that aphorism wrong? Like sometimes Ken gets this look where I like have butchered the aphorism. But I think that in trying to get the emotional payoff, we did concentrate more on that for Bloodjade, because in Ebony Gate, there was this magical heist, and she's like a detective trying to solve it and recover this artifact, right? So that was more of a plot payoff, that okay, does she or doesn't she resolve this mystery of where is the Ebony Gate and what is happening and who took it and why, right? And so um, the emotional transformation was different because it was more about her learning what her outward facing persona could be. Like, how could she become a person that has friends? That guy, like, how could she claim that part for her life, right? I think Ken might have different thoughts about uh, the emotional payoff, but I think that was something that came later, actually, for Bloodjade. Whereas sorry, it came later for Ebony Gate, but for Bloodjade, we knew going in, like, this is the emotional payoff we are aiming for.
Right.
And I think even I definitely agree with everything Julia said, and even with knowing what we wanted to do in Bloodjade, the notes that we got back from our editor were almost consistently like, all right, right here, you need to slow this part down. Like, this is a good spot for your payoff, but you're blowing through it too fast. Right? You need to stretch this out, let the reader just kind of wallow in this for a little bit, because this is a good part. This is exactly what the reader's been waiting for. I know me personally, when I get to those types of scenes for whatever reasons are effed up inside me, I'll get to those scenes and I'll just kind of like run really fast. I'm like, okay, I got it. And I'm learning slowly to kind of take those scenes and say like, okay, I recognize what this is, and and I need to stretch it out. I really need to make sure that I show Emiko's reactions to it. I need to show the reverse reaction shot to the person that she's with, right? So that you can really get the scene from both directions, and it just adds a lot more depth to it rather than the way I used to do it, which was just like, okay, they're here, they're talking, blah, done.
I don't know, maybe it's because I'm in therapy, but like I do think I can spend a little more time on a scene now to interrogate um how to make it like a full-bodied experience and Ken is funny. I don't know if he remembers this, but like the first edit letter we got back on Ebony Gate, I actually made a pie chart of how many times our editor said, "How does she feel here?" And it had a fascinating effect on the edits because once we slowed down to evaluate, like, how should she feel here? We were like, "Oh, she feels like shit. Like, this is terrible."
She's
You
having
know?
a bad time.
And
Just
so,
a bad time.
our editor, Claire was so skillful that she was able to help us stretch the emotional range of what Emiko was going through in Ebony Gate. And I think we were not able to do that on our own. And so I would say that that was maybe one of the biggest benefits for us to have this experience of working with an editor.
Yeah, and it goes back to what Jim's approach is for scenes and sequential storytelling is like you have this emotional reaction, then you have reason, review, and decision, and it's kind of like you can play with the balance of those four elements. You can put more weight into emotion based on a given scene, how heavy it is, and it's like in Emiko's case, it's also part of her character to sort of see this is how much emotional reaction she gives to a certain thing, and that says a lot about character. It says a lot about character to see how do they react to a particular thing, and when is it appropriate for those moments to be like, okay, this is like an emotional stew and we're going to like go low and slow and let it simmer, let all those flavors kind of like bubble to the surface and whatnot. And I think it is really important to have a bit of balance with an individual character or POVs or what have you, to give them sort of like the appropriate weight at the right times and not rush through it. Ken, we don't need to rush.
Yes. We're always learning. We're always learning.
Always.
Yes.
And we've learned so much from you two. Yeah.
Always works in progress. All of us are. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, kind of to close out this masterclass, I need to ask a question that, well, I have, but also a friend of mine when I was talking to them about we were doing this masterclass, was the first thing that he asked me. It was like, "Oh, what are you guys talking about this?" And I was like, "Actually, yes, we are."
I'm
But
just like, I got you covered.
Right? I got you covered. We are on the same wavelength. But what advice would you have for writers that are struggling with this? Like, I'm going to call it ending anxiety, where it's just like this fear of not being able to conclude the story in a satisfactory way, which can be paralyzing as you're drafting, right? What's your advice for kind of getting past that?
I would say to tell your story to yourself, like actually talk it through with yourself, and then does it ring true to you, right? Then tell a friend, and see if they give you emotional responses. If there are none, then it isn't enough, right? If you can get a kind of emotional response from the friend, like, oh, then you're pitching it in the right place. But it's hard to divorce your story or your product from yourself or your writing, but actually I think sometimes you have to separate it. It's like there are different stories for different times and different genres, but if you have met your genre expectation, right? Is it a mystery? Is the mystery solved, right? Is it, if it's a romance, are they, happily ever after or happily for now? Like, and if it's a particular kind of mystery, like if it's hard boiled, like, is there justice or no justice, right? So ask those questions. And I almost think separating it from you and your skill is the important part, right? Because it's not about how well you write, it's about whether or not you're meeting the reader's expectation. That's a separate thing.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot of it is really understanding like where your character is coming from, right? Like this gets back to Julia and I spending so much time in world building and character development and things like that. And I think if you're worried that your ending isn't going to ring true, I might look at like what's motivating your characters to do this. Because if it just feels like you're putting your characters through the paces to do this thing, then you've got plot that's driving your characters around, not your characters driving your plot. And I think that's usually when you have endings that don't feel right.
That's a stakes thing. I think if you don't nail the stakes for your character, then
that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then like Julia said, like, you know, like if you're worried about it, you know, jump to the end. You know, it sounds blasphemous, right? We don't want to jump to the end of the book, right? But jump to the end and write the end, you know?
Oh,
and
that's what I love about Scrivener. You could just write that thing and stick it in the end. Yeah.
Yeah, just stick it at the end, and you know, you can look at that thing and say like if you can envision the end, you know, just write it and say like, okay, is this what I want the ending to be like? Rather than having it be some nebulous thing in your head where you're like, oh, I don't think that's going to be right. You know, just get it out and see what it's like. And if it doesn't conform to what you think you want it to be, then that's at least now you have something where you can take it around to other people and say like, what's wrong with this, right? If this isn't working, and then start getting other people's opinions. But as long as it's all vague and foggy inside your head, you're not going to fix it that way.
Yeah.
Agreed. Well, on that note, this masterclass has come to an end, and we're very thankful to both of you for doing this with us. It's a bummer that we got to end it
this was so fun
and not have more conversation with the two of you, but we really appreciate this two-parter with the two of you, with Ken, with Julia. Just thank you both so much for chatting about this, for suggesting the topic. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. And for anyone who contributes to our Patreon at $5 or more each month, you can hear the lovely Julia reading a reading from Blood Jade. So go check that out. Go pick up the new book. Ebony Gate is book 1 in the Phoenix Horde. Blood Jade is book 2. Fantastic series. You can also go check out their back catalog of self-published stuff with Seattle Slayers, Cold War, and more. Both of you, can you let me know, I already know, but can you let listeners know where they can find each of you online?
I'm spending a lot of time on Instagram. I really like it there. It's just pictures and vibes.
Pretty pictures and vibes.
You can find me there.
And that's at Julia Vee Writes, yeah?
Yes.
Perfect. And Ken?
And I'm also on Instagram at Ken Bebelle. I also do have a website, kenbebelle.com. And then actually our books are on... what is it on? It's on phoenixhorde.com. That actually, we've got some stuff for our Phoenix Horde books and also for Seattle Slayers.
Right on. It's all about the vibes, you two on Instagram. Well, SFF Addicts is just fucking everywhere. It's all over the place at SFF Addicts Pod. And I'm everywhere at Adrian M. Gibson. And you can go check out Mushroom Blues. If you want an ending that is all about awakening and acceptance. And MJ, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me on all the main socials at MJ Kuhn Books, or just find all of my links to everything at mjkuhn.com. And please buy my books and help me feed my cat. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thorin Food Fun. Go support
Thorin Food
that
Fun.
Not so chunky boy. He's like 90% fur, but
he is.
Yeah.
He needs more chunk to him.
He needs more junk in that trunk. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see y'all next time on SFF Addicts.